A very warm welcome to everybody to this second Learning, Education and Development LED Lightning Talk of this year. My name is Professor Sally Elton-Chalcraft, and I'm the director of the LED Research Centre. And I would like to give a very, very warm welcome to Alexandra Brown, Alex Brown, who's going to lead the session this afternoon. Before I hand over to Alex to introduce herself more fully, I'd just like to welcome everybody else to this lightning talk. We're going to be looking at decolonial points of entry and so on, and it's really great to have Alex with us this afternoon. I've met Alex several times now. We've been working together on points of interest, and she's got a very acute mind, and I'm sure we'll have a very informative and enriching session. Just to remind people that previous lightning talks are available through, if you go through our Learning, Education and Development Research Centre pages, you can link on to the YouTubes of previous talks. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alex, who is a secondary school teacher at Ewell Castle in Epsom, and she's going to lead our session this afternoon. She's going to speak for a short amount of time, and then I'm going to chair a session where we can have a debate about some of the issues that Alex raises, and then we'll end about 5 to 2. So warm welcome to everybody, and particularly to Alex. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you, Sally. Right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alex Brown. Before I begin, I just wish to say a massive thank you to Sally for the invitation to speak to you this afternoon. It's greatly appreciated. And also a massive thank you to Bex for very much being the wind beneath my wings in terms of the organizing of this dissemination of information. So thank you so much for that. Right, am I okay to share my screen?
Bex has put in the chat the link to all the other previous YouTube lightning talks, so do check those out. And just while Alex is loading her screen, the next talk is on the 14th of December, led by Mark Chater, one of our professors of practice. Are you managing to share your screen, Alex? Oh, there we go. That's good. I think it's coming up. Brilliant. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay, great. So I will be speaking to you today on decolonial points of entry. So this is my playlist for today's discussion. So I refer to it as my playlist because I like the way it highlights how, like music, the themes that I will touch upon tell stories, ebbs and flows across time and space, and desires to add life and colour to that which is hidden, typically viewed black and white vinyl. And I borrowed this concept from the Black feminist Lola Olufemi from her book Experiments in Imagining Otherwise. So how do I summarize decolonization within a very limited amount of time? So I thought I'd just highlight some of the grounding principles, the elements that I would say are imperative to the actual core of decolonization. Take this and sort of move forward and apply it in a particular context. So at the heart of decolonizing knowledge are three guiding principles. The first is a desire to create balance. So it isn't about erasing or rewriting history. It's about trying to bring in multiple. Two is changing the terms of engagement with white Western Eurocentric knowledge. And three is to heal the colonial wounds of the ever-present physical, emotional, psychological, spiritual, political, and experience and consequences of slavery colonialism. I just wish to highlight at this point that decolonialism is exclusively a cognitive or an intellectual exercise. It does require us to be holistically present, sit with very difficult and uncomfortable truths, bear witness to the lived experiences and voices of, I think, with a particular strong focus on Black, brown and other racialized folks that is often silenced and relegated to the archives of history and is often rarely considered. So at the foundation are four elements of four, I would say. So the first is white Eurocentric knowledge is no longer understood or depicted as universal or the measure by which we judge other forms of knowledge. That requires us to explore different sites of knowledge production, question the acceptance of who the producers of knowledge are, and question the acceptance of the gatekeepers. The second is knowledge created outside of white Eurocentrism must not be inherently conceptualized and made as a backwards and primitive articulation of West. We need to move away from ideas and language such as grasping and mastering and owning knowledge. Knowledge cannot be owned. And I like to draw comparisons to that of nature. Human beings do not own nature. We don't control nature. Nature is an independent entity. It predates us. It exists alongside us. And after we're respectfully dead and gone, it will still be here. So I think it's really imperative that we're very mindful of our language, engaging with nature and with knowledge. And I think when really trying to press in on that second point, and I find this with different individuals that I've worked with the period of time, that there seems to be this understanding that those outside of the West are essentially saying what we are saying, but are not articulating it in as a palatable way as we are, or they just haven't reached our level of height and depth. As a result, there's no real need to engage with them. And I think that that is a deep colonial assumption that is part of the colonial logic that we must seek to disrupt. We're not all saying the same thing. We're not all coming at it from the same standpoint. We're not to the same conclusion. It's important that we engage with knowledge from a particular context, from a particular group, on its own terms, and we shouldn't seek to impose sort of Western Eurocentric ideas and notions and norms, engaging with it. Number 3 is decolonizing knowledge requires us to continue the anti-racist, sexist, transphobic, classist, etc. undoing and unlearning harmful ideas that we have socialized into believing since childhood. So all of these things, racism, sexism, transphobia, and so on and so forth, these are learned behaviors. No exist. The same way that we have learned it, the same way that we have socialized to believe that this is normal, acceptable, is the same way that we can unlearn. It requires us to fragment the human identity, understand that no, we're not a single entity. We can be understood and we understand ourselves in multiple facets: gender, race, class, sexual orientation, nationality, and so on and so forth.
Alex, I'm so sorry to interrupt. Is anybody else having difficulty in hearing, or is it just me?
I'm finding this quite broken up.
Yeah. Alex, is there any chance that you could either get nearer your microphone or just check your leads because I'm missing about every 10th word. Sorry to have interrupted you in your flow.
Do I sound clearer now?
I'm hoping so. Keep going anyway, and we will endeavour to try and listen more attentively. Thank you.
Apologies for that. Get closer. So yeah, sorry. With the third point, I'm saying that we need to fragment human identity in the different facets in which we understand ourselves. That could be along the lines of race, gender, sexual orientation, class, nationality, and so on. These things create a context, create a lens for which we engage and understand knowledge. So whilst we come with our assumptions and we come with our bias, of course, engaging with knowledge, again, understand it on its own terms, and that we seek to unlearn these harmful that we've been socialized into believing is true or normal since childhood. Racism and sexism is not inherent, it's not physical. These are very much learnt behaviors, and the same way that we learnt it is the same way that we to unlearn it. It requires us to be present. This isn't really something to pick up. You all have to be active in this process. And it's not for Black, brown and other racialized folks or marginalized groups to actively labor and do that work. The rest of us to, I guess, benefit off the fruits of that, present in that. And not doing so would, I guess, perpetuate this sort of colonial idea that some of us are here to serve and some of us to be served. And number 4 is that knowledge from racialized communities and other marginalized groups should not exclusively be utilized as reactionary to Western Eurocentrism. To be more specific, the white male gaze. Again, that's very much critiquing the idea of white cisgendered male heterosexual able are not objective and universal. So their experience in their lens is just as subjective as mine. It isn't any more unique. So when we're engaging with knowledge on its own terms, within its context, within history and so on, it's important that we remember that they were theorizing and they were creating and they were building alongside and independent from the West. So it's not always about this imposition. We don't always have to compare and contrast. Sometimes we can just engage with it on its own terms. The sound is still erratic. Is it the volume, or is it just
No, it's just breaking up. So we can hear like 10 words and then there's silence and then another 10 words. Do you want to just give everything a little wiggle? I always find that sometimes works.
I try and log in with my iPad.
Sorry, everybody. Technical issues, as always. The good thing is we've got, Angie says maybe if everyone turns their camera off, it might help with bandwidth. We can all do that, and at least we've got the screen with your words so that we can follow stuff. So if people try and turn their cameras off, that might help. Okay, Alex.
Okay. All right. Let me know if that still hasn't.
Okay.
Okay. I will. Okay. So my decolonial points of entry reference sheet. So I guess, can I ask everyone to just have that to hand? So yes, the decolonial points sheet. So I'll just give you a.
Okay, thanks, Alex. It is still a little bit crackly, but we'll persevere.
Trying to. All right, so there are multiple ways we can decolonize knowledge, but the 3 that I think are the easiest for teachers to apply, and I think it's really important to highlight that, because sometimes academic discourse can seldom take into account that teachers have to apply this to their practice with a level of relative ease, as it were, because of the demand of the classroom. So for me, I think that the 3 easiest ways, or the 3 main ways I would always suggest, is presenting and holding juxtaposition competing narratives through dialogue, complicating the traditional engagement, exposing the danger of a single story, and unearthing atmospheres of violence through decolonial. So I'll give you about a minute or so to just have a look through that, and then I just wish to draw your attention to a few of them.
That's fine, Alex, because people on the who are listening to it might not be able to access this quickly.
Trying to
Oh, do something with your sound.
yeah.
That's fine.
Okay. Right. In with my iPad. So I'm gonna. Guys. I don't even think that's helping, is it?
No.
No. All right.
Alex, you're on mute now.
Apologies.
Thank you. That's all right.
Thank you. I wish to draw your attention to the second section. So, what is the hidden event? So, with the first bullet point, what socio-political climate/context was the inside story born within? This requires us to engage with the internal and geopolitical climate at this particular time. So, again, placing it within its historical context, placing it within a timeline, not engaging with knowledge outside of Western thought as though it's this sort of isolated entity that wasn't born of and then have future ramifications and consequences. I wish to draw your attention to the second to last bullet point in that section. What realities of violence have gone unmourned? So, in other words, how can we give language and speak on the injustice that was not considered as such in this particular time? Within the third section, how can we animate the inanimate? To draw your attention to the last bullet point. So, who is assuming the role of the storyteller? What are their undertones and overtones? What is their vested interest in the status quo, proximity to the event and the theme in question? And this is very much asking us to consider the importance and the place of power within the context that we're engaging in. So what are the power dynamics between the storyteller and the subject? What is being inferred? It's really important when we're decolonizing that we're also reading in between the lines, asking, well, what place does power have within this particular context? And with number 4, what does the language use transmit? And again, within this particular section, we need to be mindful of the following. So how has what has been embedded within contemporary society that was then understood as normal and inevitable, how has that now endured within our times now? So what was considered normal and inevitable within that particular context, within that particular time, how has that endured? So in what way have we internalized and been socialized into believing that certain things are acceptable, unavoidable, and are almost like a necessary evil? Where is its starting point? In what way has what happened X amount of years ago, in what way is that impacting us now? And in the final section, how can we recenter the story of that of the marginalized other? Again, it's about taking an intersectional approach, so looking at gender, looking at class, so on and so forth, and then asking, how can we decenter the colonial gaze and the archetype of what it means to be human? How can we employ a lens and avoid those who have been silenced, minimalized, erased? So within the colonial logic, this is something that kind of skips through. In the colonial, the archetype of human is to be white, male, class, sexual, yes. So that is the standpoint in which we engage in most things. That is seen as having the universe. That is the embodied experience that can apparently speak for all of us. We decolonize, we're centering all of the intersections of the human. How would this look? How would this be experienced? What different conclusions would we come to when we begin to, I guess, complicate the narrative, center different approaches and lived experiences? So I typically use that reference sheet when planning my lessons, when planning schemes of work, engaging with particular texts. One of the biggest, I don't want to say criticisms, but biggest concerns for many within and outside of, I guess, decolonial circles is, doesn't the conversation center too much around race? Is there too much of a preoccupation? I currently teach in a school where many colleagues are unable to distinguish the difference between decolonizing and Black History Month. So whilst in certain circles that may almost be laughable, that is the reality of the situation, and that is where folks are coming from. It's important to address those misconceptions, regardless of whether or not that we should be, I guess, past such questions. So I want to draw your attention to the second worksheet that I sent over, entitled Theology of Disability. So I will quickly. So theology of disability, and just to say, typically within exam boards, we're required to engage in ethical dilemmas and ethical considerations within society, and also within said religion that we're studying. And typically, most conversations surrounding disability is very much centered on God loves everyone, Jesus loves everyone, Jesus healed those with disability. Constant references to the miracles. And there's this idea that, you'll be running, jumping and skipping in heaven and so on. But I find that incredibly limited. I find that very short-sighted, and I don't think that really allows for us to have a real understanding and a appreciation for what it means to inhabit a body whilst being marginalised in society, but ironically also being told that I too am created in the image. I just don't think that the way in which the exam boards have framed how we should be looking at disability and traditional understandings of disabled bodies to scripture in reference to the divine really sheds any light on that. So I've been doing a lot of work in this area and doing a lot of research. I created this handout, theology. I just wanted to share just certain extracts of it. So for those of us who don't have the sheet, I'll just read part. So disability theology can be understood as a branch of theologies of liberation, as it seeks to remind the church that working for justice is not something that is done after the gospel is preached. This is fundamental to what the gospel is. And the Black Scottish theologian John Swinton is the chair of divinity and religious studies at the School of Divinity, History and Philosophy at the University of Aberdeen. Swinton's theology of disability engages with disability from a social model, and as such he opens with the following premise. It is society's excluding and isolating practices, norms and ideologies towards those of impairments that turns an impairment into a disability. As a result, it could be understood that it is society that disables those with impairments. Disability is a societal condition that serves to oppress or exclude the participation in the social and political system. And I think what's incredibly powerful about that is, first, to consider the differences between having an impairment and disability. What does it mean in a society where your body like an inconvenience, something that should be adjusted and almost made malleable to fit with the status quo. The saying is that actually bodies are different. If your body is problematic, if we're going to use that word, then it can have an impairment. So blindness, deafness, and so on, those are impairments. But society's inability to structure in the things in order to navigate in independent human being is what disability is. But a disability isn't a reflection of your body, it's a reflection of society's inability to encompass. I think that's such an incredible and such a powerful point. I'll jump to the second theologian that I drew towards just for the sake of time. And her name is Nancy Esland. And she's a theologian, and she wrote the book The Disabled God Towards a Liberatory Theology of Disability. And she claimed the following: the way we speak of folks with disabilities is inherently excluding, as their bodies are only ever brought into conversation within the following context: sin, virtuous suffering, negative segregation lists, so separating us from charity, and oppressive readings of Jesus's 35 miracles. Consequently, this has led many to believe that the church as a city on a hill, physically inaccessible and socially inhospitable. I think closely about some of the ways in which, for instance, heaven is often described. Bright lights up in a very high, hill, and being in a land far, far away. For those of us who have mobility issues, for those of us who are sensitive to light, heaven doesn't actually seem like a very welcoming or hospitable place. Let's critique our language, let's critique the way traditional interpretations and reading of heaven has been, I guess, presented in what way is that excluding others who are also created in the image of God. And the last point of towards she also references is that so she herself has congenital bone condition and spinal sclerosis, and her theology emerged from her own experiences. So again, she didn't understand her relationship with God as navigated separate from her disability. She understood God through her disability. She says the following: I saw God in a sit-puff wheelchair, that is, chair used mostly by quadriplegics, enabling them to maneuver by blowing and sucking on a straw-like device. Not an omnipotent, self-sufficient God, but neither a pitiable, suffering servant. In this moment, I behold God as a saviour, pitying and forgiving. I recognize the incarnate Christ in each of those judged not feasible, unemployable, questionable quality of life. Here was a God. And for me, I think this is so powerful, and it reminds me of one of the crux, the points at the crux of liberation theology is the point of praying to a God that does not understand. So not that I have to make God something that God is not, or not that I have to add or take away things for God to then be relevant to my experience. But if God does not understand, God cannot empathize. If God has not suffered how I have suffered, it's the communication between God and I. How can God read down my pain, down my experience? That also then speaks to how Jesus, within a Christian lens, Jesus in human form suffered on the cross, praying to a God who suffered like I have suffered, praying to a God who's been I've been persecuted, praying to a God that marginalized like I have been marginalized. So the fact that disability theology sits within the core of liberation theology is absolutely necessary. Again, something that I think we should be drawing to. Not this God loves everyone, explicitly speaking to the society and the church, and in this context, exclude, dehumanize, and erase, quote unquote, disabled body.
Thanks, Alex. Are you almost finished? Because I'm just aware of the time.
Apologies, I've got just two more points. Okay. So typically what I would do then with my students, the reference sheet in juxtaposition to the text, I'd ask them to pick a question or two, and then that would be that's what we would discuss. That's what through those questions. So what violences have, for instance, but then reading things from the text or reading scripture within this context. Traditional lens, a typical Western Eurocentric lens doesn't offer. Jump straight to the last slide. And I think for me, this is what to achieve within the context of education.
That's great. Thank you very much. Alex, that was very, very interesting, very stimulating. Unfortunately, it was marred by the fact that there was a bit of interference there. So I do hope people will be able to have taken quite a lot from that and be able to engage in the debate. While people are formulating their questions, could I just ask, I think what I find quite interesting is this idea of exam boards and external pressures. So while other people are formulating their questions, putting their hands up, can you just talk to that for a little while about the problem as a teacher of working round and getting round the constraints of the exam board while also not putting your own students at a disadvantage, because obviously we're in a situation where exams and external regulation is really important, whether we like it or not.
I think that's a really good point. I think the first thing to say is there is a level of, I guess, flexibility and movement depending on which exam board you're with. Some exam boards are known for being more, quote unquote, academically rigorous, and others are more inclined to, I guess there's a stronger focus on just being able to apply foundational beliefs to real life experiences. So some take more of a social approach or want to highlight the social aspect of the actual content, and some just know this is actually prepping levels in university and so on. The second thing to say is the school that I teach in is actually a private school, so we're not bound by the national curriculum. So we don't follow it really up until year 9. So there is a level of freedom that I have in terms of doing certain things earlier and then drawing back to it when we're doing our GCSE. Yeah, the exam boards are very restrictive. I also ask questions about who is on the board. There seems to be this understanding that a particular group of individuals who practice a particular religion can always be objective. And their quote-unquote objectivity, which in most instances is ignorance, shows a lot with regards to the content that's displayed. I guess I would describe my pedagogy of that of fugitivity, which I'm working inside and outside of the rule, and the required content. So absolutely giving them what they need, so filtering in and decolonizing things that they wouldn't necessarily be exposed to. That in itself, of course, is very labor intensive to the reason.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Okay, so have we got any questions? Particularly maybe Scott might have a question, or Helen or Nicola. Sorry, I'm a typical teacher that picks on people when people haven't got their hands up. Very bad practice, apparently. Anybody
Okay,
got?
I'll go, Sally.
Well done.
I'll just put my knitting down. That was very good, Alex. Thank you. But I like to knit while I listen. So let me just put that down. Yes, I found that really interesting. Thank you so much. I find it, I'm very committed to this, and I find my life is got to split into two halves. There's my personal life outside of education, where I'm learning so much and things are changing for me, and every so often I'll be on a dog walk and it's like literally, you hear the phrase, the penny drops. There are times when my brain actually, there is a thunk as a thought suddenly slips into place, or I see something in a new way. And that's one half of my life. And the other half of my life is I train primary teachers to teach science with a very limited amount of time, with a format that inevitably is a bit like a secondary school, as in they're in, they're out, and then you don't see them for a year, and then they're in, they're out, and you don't see them for a year. Plus, just as Sally talked about, the constraints of Ofsted and all of those things. And I feel that there's so much more, but it's very difficult when I've got I have to send them out as being able to function in a classroom with the national curriculum, with some understanding of what science is, which is often different from what I think it is. And in some ways, I suppose it's superficial, but the only thing I've got at the moment is picking up this idea of representation. That while there's nothing wrong with being a straight white man, if you looked at professional scientists, you'd think the whole world was made up of straight white men. So I think what my question is how long did it take you to start seeing opportunities and potential within what you were teaching? Because you were brought up with a system that was very conventional and white-centric. How long did it take you to start seeing routes where you could travel, I suppose, is what I'm asking, because I feel like I'm stuck in one aspect of my life in terms of my work that I kind of go, I don't know where to go with it. That's a very wobbly question, but I'm asking for hope, I think.
That's great. That's great, Nicola. Thank you. Alex.
I really like the way you worded that, routes that I can travel. I'm gonna add that to my quote bank. So thank you for enriching me. I think that's a really excellent question, and definitely one to think beyond our conversation today. I think to answer the first part of your question, I think it's important to bear in mind that, I guess within your context, you're training teachers to teach children and prepare for jobs that do not yet exist. So there's an element of always needing to be futuristic and always remembering and bearing in mind that actually some skills and some of the content that they're learning, I may not be in a position or be in a place where I will see, I guess, the fruits of that labor. So simply because you can't see it, and simply because you be working as quickly as you like, it doesn't, that necessary work isn't taking place, that growth isn't taking place. And the second thing is, perhaps I've had somewhat of a unconventional educational experience in that I specialize in Christian theologies of liberation, and I specialize in Islam. And that was very much at the core of my undergrad and postgrad. So I've always held both in juxtaposition. So whilst the Christian element was very white and very male dominated, the Islam side was very Arab centric with touches of Southeast Asian at times. I rarely saw myself reflected in my curriculum from, primary, secondary, and even higher up. So there was always this element of, I need to find myself, I need to see myself, I need to ensure that I'm not internalizing beliefs that essentially says that Black folks and those who look like me, who come from the same part of the world I come from, have no place within only academic discourse, but within history. So for the sake of my own mental health, for the sake of my own well-being, for the sake of my own desire to progress in this particular area, I needed to find that. And I think if you engage with conversations with either your trainee teachers or your students and ask them, what is it that you desire to see? What is it that you feel is lacking? Perhaps that can also guide your work. I think part of the decolonial process is that no one is here to play the superhero. We're not perpetuating a superhero narrative. This is very collective. This is very sort of community orientated. You should encourage your students to be part of the process. You are not the sole authority of knowledge. They too hold knowledge, a different type of knowledge, more lived experience theory because of their age. This should very much be a collaborative process. I would say draw from others and draw to others, and go outside of your comfort zone, trying to build subject knowledge.
That's great. Thanks. Thanks, Alex. Thank you, Nicola. Good question. Helen.
Hello, Alex. Thank you very much for that. One of the things that decided for me to study at master's level, my education and social justice masters with the social justice element, was invigilating an English SATs reading test one year when I noticed in the reading booklet, so I was a deputy in a school that was 96% Asian heritage, who had Muslim families, and every single question that English booklet was middle class, white, British. It was the one with the cottage in the countryside, and I remember thinking these children will have no point of reference to answer this question, and I couldn't think at any point in the year where we had taught such, taught that, and I despaired, and it was that really sort of sealed the deal for me applying for my masters in social justice. So my question really is, how far do you think that the primary curriculum really does go to address these issues? Schools try to create a bespoke curriculum for themselves. I've been involved with that kind of work myself. But really, do you know how far that primary curriculum goes to addressing some of the issues that you've talked about within a secondary context? And an RE teaching context. I don't know whether, Sally, whether you can, obviously, you'll have some knowledge of this as well, lots of as well.
No, thank you, Helen, for your question. So another interesting fun fact about my school is that it has a pre-prep, a prep, and a senior school, and a sixth form.
Okay.
So in theory, you could be at the school from 5 all the way to 18, really institutionalized if you really, really, really enjoyed it that much to stay. And what's interesting is the lack of knowledge that the year sixes have when they're coming into year 7, and actually students from outside of our particular school have a stronger understanding of the different religions in comparison to the ones that come actually from school. I think that largely feeds into demographic. Actually, it's very, very white. It's very, very British. It's incredibly homogenous to a large extent, and so I absolutely resonated with vigilation. And I think that what has happened from my observation is that, even though I'm not really a fan of diversity and inclusion, I think it's problematic for many reasons, but I think what many schools have been doing, primary schools in particular, is this multiculturalism, where we're throwing everything in, and it's very superficial, it's very light, it doesn't really ask important questions, and it doesn't complicate the center. So it's, even though you eat this type of food and you speak this language at home, white and British just like us. And I think that until we are changing that central narrative of actually there is no normal, not quote unquote normal to be British, it's not normal to speak one language, and we're not sort of normalizing again that sort of Western Eurocentric gaze, then we will continue to find ourselves in this particular position. And I really do think there has to be an element of social justice in this. It's not about politeness, it's not about respectability, it's about ensuring that everyone has a fair and equal to achieve good grades in the end. And if it's culturally specific, that culturally specific narrative is continuously referred to as universal, quintessentially British, then you're always going to disenfranchise and discriminate intentionally, unintentionally against those who don't fall into that very niche category.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Helen. Phil, you have a question. You're on mute, Phil.
Sharp as ever. There we go. Alex, it's really interesting to hear what you've got to say today. I'm an ex-primary head, and with a massive social justice bent to what I do. So even in how our children are grouped, we would be learning without limits and no fixed ability grouping, because we recognise that that's also part of the social construct and social reproduction.
Yeah.
So there's a real challenge there, and I wondered to what extent you'd agree that the pedagogy that we use in school, primary or secondary, is also critical alongside the knowledge that we share, that we impart, that we discuss. Because if we're having a transmissive kind of approach to teaching, then the person who stood there, however they're embodied, is the owner of the power, where there's a more dialogic approach. And then there's a real challenge in that to what extent we're in a teacher education environment here, to what extent that is taught in order for our students to succeed. Because I sometimes feel I'm restricted into, look, you need to play the game, guys, because you need to pass and become a teacher at the end. You're going into this environment. This is what your teachers would expect. So, yeah, there is a question in there kind of somewhere about the relative importance of knowledge content and pedagogy. Just your view on it, really.
Oh, thank you. I think, it links back to what do we consider as knowledge? So what is knowledge and what is just a cute anecdote that we'll throw in at the end if there's enough time? Are we speaking on behalf of others, or are we allowing primary sources and voices to actually enter the room? What is a language that we're using when we're describing it, and even when we're introducing it? And I think that when we're talking about pedagogy, again, there seems to be this very universal approach where this is just the normal one, everything else is sort of this deviant. So when I won't name the university, but when I was doing my teacher training at a particular university that is very entrenched in tradition, I'm coming here with my social justice hat on, black feminist hat on, and I'm talking about critical pedagogy and deconstructing the colonial law and so on. That didn't go down well, as I'm sure you can imagine. And it was sort of phrased to me as, this is all well and good and this is interesting, but that rainy afternoon when the children are being difficult, is this really going to get the job done? So it's almost sort of positioning alternative ways of thinking, being, doing, and sense-making epistemologies as this luxury that we can afford to not have. And I think that in itself puts us at a disadvantage right from the very start. So I guess if I'm, as a secondary school teacher, speaking to primary ed teachers, primary school teachers, I would say that it's really important to engage in different types of pedagogy. I think I'm like really unapologetic in my centering of social justice. And I also think it's about engaging with your wider community. I think that reflects the body of students, the body of the wider circle. And I think unless you're doing that, then you're perpetuating the status quo. And again, the grouping is interesting because even though we're was doing it in sets and ability, there was a cultural bias involved. Knowingly and unknowingly, you're still upholding that which you claim to try to dismantle. I think it does link back to teacher training, and that's becoming more apparent, I guess. I don't really have a neat and a final answer. I'm still very much thinking this through, and I'll be scratching my head until the early hours of the morning, I think. But I think it's about the knowledge and the sources and the thinkers that the teachers are exposed to, are encouraged to engage with, and are forced to engage with in terms of, no, this is required reading. I think unless that changes, then we're not going to see structural long change. It will be very superficial changes in order to tick a box.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Alex. Any other questions? Scott or Angie or Fiona or anybody else? While they're thinking of a question, I'm quite interested in this idea that you spoke about earlier, Alex, of the teachers in your school and their kind of like closed eyes. I'd worked with some student teachers several years ago now, where I got them to interview their peers, because I felt if I interviewed them, they would feel as though they've got to say the right thing. So I got students from another course to interview these student teachers, and during one of the interviews, one of the students said, "Do you know what? My eyes have been opened. I had never thought about that before until you'd raised it." And I think it's this idea that people find it very difficult to put themselves in somebody else's shoes and to literally get out of their ethnic, gender, ableist or disabled or whatever body position, and look at things from another perspective. And so the example that I often use in my own teaching is looking at the dating system, so BC and AD and BCE, before the Common Era, and the Common Era. And for some students, it's like, oh, I didn't even know there was a different dating system. And it's not such a matter of sort of saying to the students, well, you choose now which one you want to use, but it's more what Phil was talking about earlier. I think it was Phil, children co-constructing, and so talking to the children about this and working together. And to what extent do you try and work with, and this is, I don't mean this to be a critical at all, but to what extent do you feel you can work with the other teachers in your school who maybe are just not at that stage?
No, I think that's a brilliant question. Another fun fact: I'm the only black teacher in the school.
Yeah. That's what I was getting at, because I knew that.
Yes. So the only black teacher in the school, and that in itself has come with its challenges and its issues. It's interesting. Some of my students, I'm the first black teacher they've ever had, and I think for many of my colleagues, I was leading a whole school. I led on 5 sessions of whole school DPDs and decolonising the curriculum. And I think for many of my colleagues, this was the first time they've ever had a black teacher or someone leading them wasn't white. And there was a lot of kickback. There was a lot of discomfort. It's not easy to hear some of this. And I think it's probably harder coming from someone who isn't white and someone who find the fact that I am a black woman, that kind of added insult to injury. So there was an element of, I'm not the only one who's saying this. The head must clearly think there's something in it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be having this conversation. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asked for outside organisations to come in and do that work. But it seems to be slightly more offensive when certain groups within society are saying that which others are saying. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing is, when we're decolonizing, it requires us to sit with this uncomfortable truths of I have internalized racism, or I have internalized sexism, or I have internalized homophobia, or whatever it be. And no one likes to think of themselves in that way. It requires us to really reflect on who we are as human beings and how we wish to show up in the world, unintentionally uphold. And again, this is very uncomfortable, it's very unsettling. We're not all at a place where we can do that work. And if we struggle to hear uncomfortable truths in other aspects of our lives, you're not going to appreciate someone who's significantly younger than you, who doesn't come from the same background as you do, telling you that by not critiquing or not challenging or not including this, ironically, you are upholding that which you claim to be against. So there is the element of the personal is very much political in this. With regards to colleagues being part of the world ending and making process, it's interesting because it's a very white British school. There's this kind of stiff upper lip. But even with those who did agree or did think that there was something in what I was saying, there wasn't this sort of outwardness in showing support, sort of clear congratulations or anything like that. Not that I was expecting flowers, red carpet or anything, but silently agreeing and maybe starting to do the work behind closed doors, but they're not say thank you or let's collaborate. So there's also been, I guess, I've also had to learn and understand that ways in which I'd like to collaborate and work with others is not perhaps going to be possible of who, but there's an element of me just to the environment as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Alex. Fiona, would you like to read your question, or shall I read it? I'll read it.
Oh, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it. Thank you.
Sorry. I'll just. Yeah.
This is really interesting. I used to work at in a Southwest university, and we were working with a range of state schools and some private schools in the area to try and look at how we could almost pilot learning from each other to so that you don't have, for example, if for you, Alex, you're the person who's championing this and spearheading it in your school, that you wouldn't feel isolated and that you'd have other people, even if it's across institutions, to kind of have this conversation about how are you approaching it and how can you involve and co-create with your students. But I think it was a very start of a conversation, and actually over probably a course of months with some fairly kind of senior leaders in their curriculum, it was the main thing that came up was this discomfort, which is not surprising. So the fact that you've got a range of people who aren't sure where to start, were not even necessarily some of the people who were interested in this happy with the language. So I completely understand it as you do, and you introduced it as it's not erasing, it's broadening and making sure that you have that kind of, I'm paraphrasing now, but like that 360 view. And one of the heads of a school was really worried, history background, we shouldn't be erasing. It's like, that's not what we mean by this. So I think there's an awful long way to go, even to get almost, even if you can get there, like an understanding of what's meant by this, so that people can feel like they can implement it or get behind it or work out how to approach it. So it's not a simple answer to a question, but if you think there are a few kind of key things that would help with this culture shift, which is what I think it needs to be, because as someone that's worked with outreach for universities, with schools and colleges, it can't just be that it's tokenistic curriculum change, or you need families or carers or people having those conversations with their young people to make sure that there's, like you said, there's a comfortable space to talk about some of these big issues and some of these questions. So what do you think would help maybe with that, so that it's kind of multiple people can own it in terms of taking on some of that responsibility, that it's not just tick box and tokenistic?
Thanks, Fiona. Alex, just before you answer that, Nicola has a question as well. So if we could try and be very quick.
Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona.
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted Fiona. Okay, so the first thing I guess I would say that, I guess for me, the big question is asking all of the teachers, what does it cost us to continue with the way that things are, and what does it cost us to not change? I think when we look at what it costs us to not change, it far outweighs what it costs to maintain the status. I think that when, for example, you explore the really deep impact of not seeing yourself reflected in the disparaging and dehumanizing language is often used, referring to those who look like you, and you're just erased completely, where does that impact one's mental being, one's imagine themselves in positions of, how can I think that I can have a high job when I've never been taught by someone? I think that when we approach it from that lens, when we get human, as opposed to constantly theorize and, you know, big academic jargon at it, becomes something that we at the beginning, holistically present. This is not explicitly cognitive exercise. I also think there needs to be support for teachers doing this labor and doing this work. I think there needs to be support for teachers who are finding this work difficult, very challenging. And by support, I say spaces where they can come together and have a conversation. I also think in terms of doing this work, it doesn't go maybe the way they desired it to go. There's kickback and there's pushback, and some are acting inappropriately in a position of power and authority. Absolutely have knock-on consequences and so on. So I think that structures need to be in place before we can start doing this. I think unless it does, and something that I've noticed personally in conversations with other work, decolonizing seems to bring out the worst in certain individuals. And unless we can ensure that they're supported, doing the work are supported, then potentially things can arise that could acquire.
Thanks, Alex. Alex, unfortunately, it's getting increasingly difficult to hear you, but thank you for that answer. That was very good. I'm just aware of the time, and a lot of people are saying that they do have to leave now. So, Nicola, I'm sorry, we can't ask your final question. Just very quickly, Angie Boyle says UOC have access to the Union Black training, which Bex has put a link in the chat. Can I just thank Alex very, very much indeed? Really stimulating session. Thank you very much. And we'll try and make the slides available as well as this video. So thank you so much for attending. Sorry we couldn't have all the questions. It's obviously a very interesting topic. Alex, if you stay on the call, please. Everyone else, enjoy the rest of your afternoon and do check out the rest of our online YouTube lightning talks. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye.